Hello, I'm Ralph Baer.
You may not know his name.
If you look into Encyclopedia Britannica, you'll find that Nolan Bushnell is the inventor of video games. Sylvie?
You may not know what he did.
As he's thinking about this, what he comes up with is, hey, I wonder if you could play a game.
Basically, that's the genesis of the video game industry.
I think what Ralph Baer did was brilliant.
But his impact on the world of gaming is immeasurable.
He invented video games, the patents in his name. You can't deny that.
This is the forgotten story of Ralph Baer.
Boom, I got you.
The story of Ralph Baer begins before personal computers, video game consoles, and the internet.
I was born in Germany in 1922 and lived there until 38.
He grew up Jewish in Germany, which wasn't a good thing to be there. They kicked him out of public school because he was Jewish. He had to go to a Jewish school.
But he was old enough to know boys who made it into the Hitler Youth and to know that things were not right.
My father was a representative for shoe factories in the town that I was born in Germany. In school, we played soccer, of course. Every European kid plays soccer. I did some swimming, that's about all.
His family escaped Germany, which was 3 months before Kristall Night, which was the night of broken glass, which symbolized the beginning of the Holocaust. So they got out just in time.
Well, actually, it was very benign. When you think of escaping Nazi Germany, you might get visions of clandestinely crossing a border. It was nothing like that. I got in a train, stayed for several days with distant relatives of my father's. My mother and my sister came the day afterwards. And 2 or 3 days later, we got a steamship and sailed across the ocean.
He came to America and got involved in self-schooling. He's a very smart man. He was largely self-educated.
We arrived in New York and went to work in a factory, making $12 a week for 10 hours a day, half a day Saturdays, out of which I spent $1.25 for a correspondence course. Became a radio technician, began to do all the service work for 3 radio stores in New York City, fixing and repairing and installing antennas of early television sets, early FM sets. And in 1943, Uncle Sam knocked on my door and I got drafted. And within months, I was in England. By that time, I'd been trained as an interrogator of prisoners of war. And I was part of an MIT military intelligence team that went over to Europe in a convoy zigzagging across the Atlantic. Next thing I know is I'm doing the syllabus for teaching GIs to recognize German weapons, handle German weapons, recognize German uniforms, heavy weapons. I had a whole museum full of hardware.
He was on duty in England. It was pouring rain outside, and he wound up in pneumonia. He wound up in the hospital. And the day he wound up in the hospital, the rest of his troop was shipped to Normandy.
After the war, Baer attends classes at the American Technical Institute of Television.
Ralph completed a program in Chicago, a trade school, and he was one of the first people to have a degree in television engineering. Back then, it wasn't a degree, nobody got it, and he was the first.
With his new degree in hand, he steps into the budding world of electronics.
In 1950, Ralph began working for L'Oreal, which was a TV manufacturer in New York City. One of the first projects that his manager had him make was build the best TV set you can make, better than anyone else can make one.
Another guy and I sat in the screen room for a year and built a set from scratch, everything from the front end to the tail end. My job was building the radio frequency sections, the power supply, reflection circuitry, and all that good jazz.
And Ralph got this idea to employ some kind of game in the TV. He didn't know what kind of game, definitely not a video game, but something to make TV interactive.
I looked at what we were doing, and especially at how we were testing the set. To set up a set in those days, there was test equipment to set up sets so they would leave the factory properly adjusted. Those test equipment could produce vertical and horizontal bars, and these bars could move around. It was kind of fun to do it. I said, why don't we build something like that into a TV set? You make a game of it.
But his management, they didn't like the idea.
And I proposed that to the chief engineer, and he said, well, you're already 2 months behind schedule. Forget it. Build the goddamn set and get it over with.
Ralph Baer's idea for an interactive game built into a television doesn't take off. But little does he know that he is on the brink of making history.
Get me, come get me. I'm the Red Baron. I'm gonna get you. Boom, 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 boom.
15 years after working as an engineer for Loral, Ralph Baer finds himself working as a manager at Sanders Electronics.
I'm in charge of a division that by this time has grown to some 500 engineers. I don't have much time for anything except being a chaplain, and taking care of people problems. So I built a little skunk works in a room off to the side that nobody knows anything about, so I can do a little private R&D work.
While he's on a business trip, Baer revisits an old idea.
I'm in New York, waiting for somebody to come in to join me.
You have Ralph Baer sitting in a bus stop thinking, what can you do on a television set besides watch television?
And all of a sudden, he had what he likes to say, one of his eureka moments.
What he comes up with is, I wonder if you could put a local signal on that TV that would be a controllable signal.
And I made some notes on a spiral pad. I sat down the next morning, September 1st, 1966, and wrote a 4-page paper that lays it all out. Describes the concept of playing games on a home television set or with a monitor. Describes playing stuff that comes out of a box, like sports games, quiz games, or board games.
Baer quickly starts work on his new idea. By October 20th, 1966, he finishes the first prototype of his game box.
We built a piece of equipment that allowed us to move a spot around the screen.
They got a game working called what they called Fox and Hounds, which is just a chase game. One dot chase another dot. This was interactive TV. No one else did it before.
The object was to make something that would be fun, right? Well, chasing a spot around the screen was fun enough, but not for very long. So I had a gun. We converted that, and then we started shooting at the screen.
Then he spent the next few days talking to his management to convince them to go ahead with this idea.
So the next thing I knew was I was going to demonstrate to the whole board of directors, and the demo had to go off well.
This is a chase game? All right, let's play. Come get me.
The reaction of the board of directors was very enthusiastic.
It was some feat that he did it because Sanders is a military contractor. They don't deal with consumer products, but yet they gave him the go-ahead for this by giving him $2,000 in seed money.
Oops, you got me.
And basically, that's the genesis of the video game industry.
You got me. End of the game.
In 1967, Baer gets a helping hand.
Bill Harrison, at the time he worked for me, was probably in his late 20s. He was joined by a guy by the name of Bill Rush.
Bill Rush understood fun. He comes up with ways to make it a little more fun. So pretty soon, they have a little block that you can pass back and forth on the screen. The goal is to try and hit it with your paddles, to catch it. Well, what if instead of catching it, we bat it back and forth and have like a tennis game?
We built several more boxes that were progressively more efficient. By the time we got up to number 6, we had handball games. It's no longer a net, it's the wall. We had a volleyball game, which was a side view with a half-height net. We also had gun games again, but we made a big mistake. We didn't stop at 6. We had so many ideas what else to do, we went to number 7, which turned into a much larger unit, which everybody knows as the brown box because it was covered with brown wood grain adhesive paper.
The executives from Sanders got together, played it, everybody loved it. And then the next step was, what do we do with this?
What you're dealing with is somebody who's looking at an appliance that's in everybody's home. He's trying to think of something that will actually reach the common man.
There was real concern on my part that having spent the money, I wasn't going to go anywhere because it wasn't obvious what to do with it. What store? Where? Who's going to build it?
The first idea was to try to interact with cable. So they brought down Irvin Kahn, who was Mr. Cable at the time from Teleprompter. Their idea was to deliver this game through cable.
And then I brought up one of the two guys who invented the teleprompter. And they were then the largest cable company in the country. Saw the demo, was quite impressed. Went back to New York and caused the president to come up 2 weeks later. And we got into a negotiation, our own technical plan, somebody else did a business plan. We spent quite a bit of time on all that. And then it all went down the chute because there was a money crunch at the time.
At the time, the cable TV industry is still new, and Teleprompter decides not to risk supporting the strange new device.
And I was back to square one. So I know what the hell was I going to do.
Ralph Baer has his game box ready to go. Unfortunately, no one seems to know what to do with it. But Baer isn't ready to give up yet. Ralph Baer has created the world's first home video game console, dubbed the Brown Box. Now, he must figure out how to sell it.
Ralph was interested in connecting his box up to a TV set, which 40 million people in the United States had televisions. You just connect with 10% of them, you have a hit product.
Then it occurred to me, it was like a flash out of the dark. There are TV manufacturers all over the country. They have production lines that can handle the kind of stuff that's inside of my game hardware. So they're a logical place to go to.
So they started calling different television manufacturers, Zenith, Sylvania.
Everybody was quite impressed, but they weren't impressed enough to move immediately, except for RCA, Jerry Martin, who was in charge of television production. And when we got done demonstrating, everybody still sat around the table looking semi-unfriendly, except for Jerry Martin. He said, "It's a go."
Then Bill Enders with RCA moved to Magnavox. First thing he did was tell people, hey, there's this product I saw, why don't we take a look at it?
In 1969, Magnavox licenses the technology behind the Brown Box, and in 1971, they released the world's first home video game console, the Odyssey.
If you looked inside, you'd find very few differences in the Brown Box.
The Odyssey, which was the first home video game, set the standards of what came afterwards. It had two controllers, it had plug-in cards. Although the games themselves were built into the console, it was capable of playing 12 different games by changing the cartridges around. It had an add-on, you can get a light rifle.
But the launch of the Odyssey doesn't go as well as Baer hopes.
Magnavox released the Odyssey in May of 1972.
Distribution, it was kind of slow for a number of reasons.
Now, Ralph envisioned Odyssey to be a game in a box for 20 bucks. Magnavox didn't share his vision. They made him a much bigger, more elaborate, more expensive product. They saw a $100 product. $100 was a lot of money. That wasn't a toy. People didn't want to experiment with a $100 toy.
I can only imagine trying to explain to somebody this whole idea of that you play a game on a screen. It's just like, what?
They gave the impression that it could only hook up to Magnavox television sets. Most people who didn't have a Magnavox television set didn't even bother to look at it.
You had all these games with Odyssey, but they were a nightmare. The technology wasn't there yet. But then you had these overlays, these static overlays that you put on your television. So if you're playing hockey, you put a blue overlay on it. If you're playing football, you put a green overlay. It's a lot of bother. It just didn't catch on.
The future isn't looking good for the Odyssey, but Baer's console eventually gets an unexpected boost, thanks to a man named Nolan Bushnell.
Once Magnavox got into pre-production and in production, they were ready to show to the world and travel the country.
They're trying to show people what Odyssey is, and they're holding these kind of Magnavox internal trade shows. And they got to do one in Burlingame. Nolan Bushnell, who at the time was working for a small arcade game manufacturer, he hears about this, and he goes, and he even gets to play Odyssey.
I thought the games were pretty poor. I thought the technology was very interesting, that they were able to do what they could do for the price that they had at that point in time.
And he played the ping pong game, of course. In retrospect, he says he wasn't very impressed. And I can understand why he wasn't impressed.
What Nolan Bushnell does next will be the subject of many debates in the coming years.
And Al Cohen built a ping pong game, and they call it Pong. was out there and we knew of it. And video game business, yes, is often flying.
Yeah, it was a real cultural phenomenon. So that was like a regular, just part of the culture. Everybody saw this thing and wanted to try it out. Everybody had heard of it. It's like, oh, there's that Pong thing I've heard about.
I believe that we were able to help Odyssey a great deal by the success of the arcade game.
And now all of a sudden, people realize, well, you know, they were hooked on Pong. By buying the Odyssey, they could have Pong at home.
The popularity of Pong helped spur sales of the Odyssey. And by 1975, 350,000 units are sold. Still, it's not enough for Magnavox. But thanks to Ralph Baer's detailed record keeping, Magnavox will eventually make millions off of the Odyssey. By 1974, Pong is a full-blown phenomenon, and Nolan Bushnell is reaping the benefits. Meanwhile, things aren't going so well for Ralph Baer and Magnavox, but Baer's meticulous record keeping ends up saving the day.
Atari was very successful with Pong. At the same time, Magnavox is really limping along with their Odyssey. And somebody says, hey, you know, that's kind of using our technology there. Why don't we sue them?
Around 1968, Ralph applied for a patent for his work.
Every stage of creation for Ralph Baer is meticulously recorded. Ralph doesn't do anything unless he records it, for lots of reasons, for legal purposes, also because he wants to see what he did. He is a quintessential engineer.
Ralph Baer got a patent on one of the most basic things. The patent really involves how you tell interactions on screen, how you tell that the bullet hit the spaceship and therefore something has to happen at that location, and telling those interactions what they managed to patent, which is the basis for most of these games.
Well, every video game that came out in the early 70s, it involved the business of interaction between manually controlled and machine-controlled spots.
Atari's Pong infringed on a lot of Ralph's patents. Sanders and Magnavox did what they had to do. They took Atari to court.
But at that time, we were making money hand over fist and saw that as a huge distraction. There was then an offer for settlement. I looked at how much money I was spending on attorneys versus how much I could settle it for, and I decided, let's settle it, get it out of the way, move on, next. So we got a paid-up royalty worldwide.
In effect, Atari was Magnavox's first licensee.
The real benefit, and it was a huge benefit, wasn't from selling the product. It was from licensing the technology.
Baer's patent is a legal juggernaut. Game companies are faced with two choices: fight Magnavox in court and lose, or pay to license the technology.
Magnavox's strategy was very clear. They wanted to get the big dog, us, to settle, and then they go around and they make money on everybody else.
Is this Exhibit 62 what's referred to as the brown box?
Yes, that's it. We won lawsuits. It wasn't even so much a question of who invented video games first. They simply infringed certain claims. If any part of that's infringed, they owe you something. We won every one of them.
Were you aware of any video games?
I object to that question. He has no reason to believe he's not aware of a lot of things.
Please do not testify before your witness.
I'm not testifying. I'm complaining about your approach.
As long as the patents held out, Magnavox just still continued making money through 1984, 1985, when Nintendo and Sega entered the market. All of them paid royalties to Magnavox and Sanders.
Magnavox finally has the profit they've been seeking. But as they win one legal battle after another, they find themselves losing the war in the stores.
In 1977, Atari came out with the Atari Video Computer System, the VCS, later known as the Atari 2600. Then, of course, Magnavox had to compete.
Odyssey, Video Game 1.
So they came out with the Odyssey 2, which had a keyboard built into it, but they just couldn't keep up with Atari. They later made plans around 1983 to come out with an Odyssey 3, but they finally scrapped that, and then they just got out of the business altogether.
Ralph Baer eventually leaves Magnavox. For the next few years, he will go on to create a collection of electronic games and toys. Baer never returns to the home console business that he helped birth, and as time goes by, his legacy begins to fade.
This is not what I had in mind.
Unfortunately, Ralph does not receive the recognition that he deserves. Nolan Bushnell did such an incredible job with the media that people think of him as the inventor of video games. And it's a shame.
I think what Ralph Baer did was brilliant. The technology he had at the time was really neat. I think that he was an engineer and not a very good game player. I think that was the problem.
If you look into Encyclopedia Britannica, you'll find that Nolan Bushnell is the inventor of video games. So, Levy?
He should get the recognition that he deserves. He invented video games. The patent's in his name. You can't deny that.
And, you know, he's not even looking for money. What Ralph Baer really would like people to say is, hey, thank you for inventing video games. He just wants credit for what he did, which is reasonable because he did a lot.
But Baer isn't completely forgotten. In 1979, he's named Inventor of the Year by the state of New York, and in 1980, he receives the same honor from New Hampshire. As the game industry continues to grow and thrive, its roots can still be traced back to the work of Ralph Baer.
Ralph's contributions to the world of video games is immense. Everything that was in the brown box is still around today. The controllers, the light guns, the interchangeable games. He doesn't consider himself a big deal. To him, he's Ralph Baer. He's an engineer. So what? I'm Ralph Baer. That's the type of person he is.
Video games are, hands down, the most important thing I did. Well, it's not the most important things I did. The most important things I did is have a nice family and creative kids, and nice grandkids who are up to their eyeballs into video games. So I've had a good run, no complaints.